There's a lot going on for this full moon in Aquarius. Welcome, everybody. Are you ready for the Aquarius full moon on the same day as the Democratic National Convention, which is wild? That could be very interesting because I think that this full moon is going to have a lot of impact on a mundane level. This full moon will impact your individual charts. For me, this full moon is ultimately about action. There's a lot of impulse for action, but also temporary restriction in terms of Saturn. Saturn is in a T-square with Jupiter and Mars. Saturn is overcoming Mars in a square. Mars wants to do a lot. Mars in Gemini, there's probably a sort of internet activity, a lot of news activity, maybe even a lot of high passions because we're talking about it being conjunct Jupiter. So Jupiter may be expanding the activity of Mars. Mars is about action, passion, aggression. Mars in Gemini is amped up. Mars is comfortable in fire signs and air signs like Gemini. You can fan the flames of whatever drive and motivation is going on. But then you have Saturn in Pisces behind Mars. Saturn in the mundane world can represent government administrations. This could be government restricting media. On a personal level, you've got that T-square with Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. In some sense, there is a restriction, and Venus in fall. So Venus, everything about relationships, money, connecting, even markets. This can have to do with financial markets as well. There's some restraint on all those matters. And there's also Mercury retrograde. There's some sense of critical review. And even on a personal level, people may be feeling overly critical of themselves. So when you think about the full moon, this full moon is a culmination of the new moon that was about 6 months ago. So one of the things in your own personal chart is go back and think about February 9th, 2024. So think about what happened back in February when there was a new moon at 20 degrees of Aquarius. That new moon, that was pretty Aquarius heavy. Pluto was at 0 degrees of Aquarius. Think about what was happening six months ago. Whatever you started back then 6 months ago may not have been developing yet. And there's some restraints on what you were planning to do. It could be that money, you didn't have enough money to complete what you're doing, or there's some regulations and rules that you're trying to get through. It may be spending a lot of time thinking about it in your head. And that's what this T-square is about. There's a restriction and a lot of going into the details. I think this full moon will help us step back and look at the larger picture. We need to focus more in the Sagittarius area, which is the larger picture, right? Jupiter is in Gemini. Focused on details and can't grasp the larger picture. We need to balance out that T-square to break through the restrictions, is to step back and take a look at the larger picture. Then we have the other T-square between the Sun, Moon, and Uranus. With this full moon, you could get sudden breakthroughs, but maybe not before some chaos or radical turning around of things. With Uranus in Taurus, this is shaking up where you've been firmly in place when you're trying to manifest whatever it is you've been trying to manifest over the past 6 months. Something outside your control related to material possessions, money, or comfort. Something can trigger you to be able to see what it is you are wanting for your own self, your own purpose, your own path, but that also allows you to be part of a larger community. The Leo Aquarius axis is about your personal path, Leo, what makes you shine, but also how are you going to be shining as part of the larger group, and how much are you going to be a part of that larger group as well. I mean, I'm an Aquarius, so I understand there's a thing about being Aquarius where, you know, you like to be for people and around people, but also you're set a little bit farther apart from people. I use traditional rulers, so I can see that because Saturn rules Aquarius, and Saturn being far out, we like to keep to ourselves. I think Aquarius have ideas about rules for people, which is why Pluto in Aquarius is not necessarily going to be the way people think. There's a focus on Pluto at 0 degrees. When Jupiter and Saturn conjuncted at 0 degrees of Aquarius in 2020, that marked a new 200-year period of these conjunctions in air. Starting from 1980 was the preview to what's going on now and for the next decades. Personal computing first started, and when things started building up in, actually it's 20 years, so things started building towards the dot-com era. When the dot-com bubble burst, that was when Saturn and Jupiter started one more conjunction in an earth sign in Capricorn. So that was wrapping up previous decades. Now we're in air, and now Pluto is exactly on 0 degrees, and it's gone back and forth over it a couple of times. So Pluto is digging up now the things that need to be brought up for this next 20 years while Pluto's in Aquarius, and what is starting this new couple 100-year cycle in air. That all is coming up right now. We're in a turning point in terms of the larger society on a mundane level, because we have Saturn in Pisces in an opening square to Jupiter. Okay, so if you think about moon cycles, so you're always talking about looking at the planetary cycle from conjunction to conjunction. So when we're looking at the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, and we're now in the opening, it's if it were the moon and the sun, it would be the first quarter, right? So we've got Jupiter in Gemini and Saturn in Pisces. And so what happens at that first quarter, it's a square, right? So squares are they're in the nature of Mars. So it's demanding in society some sort of action, but there's a conflict. There's, Saturn, what kind of structure are we going to get? Jupiter, how are we going to expand? And right now, there's some sort of friction in terms of working that out. This full moon in Aquarius is happening at the same time as the DNC convention, because things are being decided now in terms of where we're going, where we're headed. If you think about it, the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction at the end of 2020, when was that, right? That was when things were trying to be figured out about who won the election, right? And now we're at the square of that, trying to decide who is going forward on this one side. How is the United States going to be carried forward? Take a look at these Jupiter-Saturn aspects, because you're going to see each time there's a Jupiter-Saturn thing going on, you'll see some sort of big shift, at least societally. That's big with this full moon in Aquarius. One of the things I was looking at is which planets are in charge of the full moon. So first we have, because it's the moon and the sun, so obviously the moon in Aquarius has Saturn ruling it. And then the sun in Leo is ruling itself. So the sun is strong in this full moon. Look at your Leo section of your chart is going to be really strong, and it's really going to be focused on what you want to do to shine. That's going to be really strong. The sun is strong in this. However, there is, the way I've been looking at it, aside from going into Saturn ruling the moon from Pisces, it's actually a little bit, what you need to do is not so clear because Saturn can't see the moon from Pisces. We have T-squares here. Whatever needs to be resolved in your Aquarius house is on hold, but there's definite activity. Mars is in charge of this moon. The sun and Saturn rule their areas, but Mars is the bounds lord. Each sign has 5 subdivisions. I also have the decans on there. I'm not talking about the decans. These are the Egyptian terms. I'll call it the bounds. We dive deeper into the chart and see at those degrees what planet is in charge of organizing what's going on there. And the ultimate, the final dispositor for the sun and moon is Mars. So that means that there is definitely some action that's going to need to be taken having to do with this moon. For this full moon, we've got Mars in Gemini with Jupiter at the basis of this full moon. So you think about, what's your Gemini house? What action do you need to take in your Gemini house? What beliefs do you have about your Gemini houses? For me, Gemini is my 11th house of friends, networks, hopes, wishes, and dreams, returns from whatever it is I do in society or for my career. So what action do I need to take in my Gemini 11th house to shine light on my 7th house Aquarius related to partnerships, maybe marriage or business partnerships, or maybe even legal contracts? What is it that I need to do in that area to bring things to fruition in that 7th house? And this full moon will help us do that. But it's like there's some conversations maybe that need to be had because we're talking Gemini. There's some expansion of your beliefs in your Gemini house that need to happen because you've got Jupiter there. So it's going to be about your beliefs. So if I were you, I would focus on Mars in Gemini with this full moon. The other thing I wanted to say about this Aquarius moon or full moon. So it's at 27 degrees. 27 degrees. So I brought up the Egyptian terms already. Those little 5 divisions that I have on the inside colored ring. So when the moon is going to be in Saturn's terms and the sun in Mars terms. Every time you're at the end of a sign, it's the end of things. This is Saturn consolidates things. Saturn reduces things to get things to the essential. Mars cuts things. So we really are at the end. I know that everybody says a full moon is a culmination, and usually people say it's the peak of something, but this particular full moon really does have that sense of we're really at some final peak of something because it is at the late degrees of the sign. I said that Mars is, I don't want to say it's in charge because the sun is still in charge of the sun and Saturn is still in charge of the moon. But when we go down to that 27th degree, Mars is in charge, and Mars is in his own terms in Gemini. There is a passion for communication, a drive to get information. I've told you, think about Mars, because I do think when we're talking about the bound lord, and this, don't be surprised if, something you decide if something comes to an end. I'm not saying anything. I think if anything happens on the day, on Monday, it would be related to mundane stuff like the convention or in a country. I haven't looked at all the other countries and how this impacts them. Oh, I didn't even pull up the chart. There is something, this full moon is exactly on the moon of the US chart in the third house at 27 degrees. The US Sibley chart has a 27-degree Aquarius moon. So the people of the United States are like Aquarians. They like communication. Aquarius in the third house, communication, technology, this all makes sense. So we already did, whoever asked about if I have an Aquarius moon, does this mean something? Yeah, the people of the United States could be, I mean, what is the, Uranus is in the sixth house. That has to do with workers, the workforce. There's going to be some shocking news for the people, and this is actually a new, probably just like it's a culmination for the people in terms of information. Like is probably potentially going to be peak information. But you know that this moon cycle that started in February doesn't really end until the next new moon in Aquarius. So it doesn't necessarily mean everything's going to happen on that day. Potentially could, though, because these T-squares look gnarly. And the other thing I was thinking, because the sun in the Sibley chart is going to be in the ninth house, whole sign house of the Sibley chart. The sun relates to the head, say the president or whatever of a country. So I don't know, does that mean like the president's going to be doing something in, what is that? I think the ninth house has to do with, I've heard this one astrologer, Lunatic Astrology, I think is her name. If you follow her on YouTube, I love her stuff. I think she calls the ninth house the hand of the king, so like the vice president. Maybe it's just that there's a lot of focus on the current vice president and maybe future vice president. The T-square requires you to look at the empty spot. You see how Capricorn, Sag, and Scorpio, even Libra to some extent, there's no activity there. This T-square is saying, how do I get out of this blockage between what my purpose is, what I need for freedom and innovation in your Taurus house, needing to even break free from maybe some of this, all of this material stuff you have, or this need for comfort. Some sort of change happens that's out of your control. But meanwhile, if you're in the Scorpio house doing your strategy, then the Mars and Gemini will get you on your way. When you're dealing with the outer planets, even the social planets, Saturn and Jupiter, try not to resist what they're asking, and they can lead you where you need to go. Yes, lots of head stuff and push for action. So I'm just thinking with this Saturn square Mars, it can be frustrating. People say Mars and Saturn can work together. Saturn gives structure, Mars gives motivation. So if you can make sure, even in a square, when there's a square, it means that there's something outside your control that happens and causes conflict between what you're trying to do and some sort of structure you have. So it's really just about how do you manage two things to try to do what you need. But if you can get Saturn and Mars together, you can really work hard and sustain your activity.